Thanks, Tom. As Tom said, I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail about what our priorities and activities are going forward, because if you're going to give us the feedback we aspire to get, a little bit more detail about what we're going to be doing over the next 12 months and beyond, I think is essential to make that happen in the best possible way. As Tom said, our mission is to accelerate the move to a low-carbon economy. And when we were set up in 2001, we looked at what that actually means in practice. And what it means then and what it means now is broadly doing two things. First, it's about deploying existing technologies at scale, or as we say in the slide here, to cut carbon emissions now. And secondly, and in parallel, it's about developing the low-carbon technologies of tomorrow, or cutting future carbon emissions. And what that translates to in practice, in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis, in terms of reducing carbon now, we provide specialist support and advice and finance. And we also set standards, voluntary standards, to help companies and organizations reduce carbon emissions. In terms of technology development and reducing future carbon emissions, it's about leading industry-wide collaborations to accelerate the development of technology sectors. It's about investing selectively in exciting emerging technology, and it's about opening markets for no-carbon technologies and products. So a little bit about our achievements. In terms of carbon now and deploying existing technologies, we've worked with over 75% of the FTSE 100. We've worked directly with tens of thousands of companies and a very significant proportion of the public sector. I think significantly we've helped organizations save 1.4 billion. And as Tom referred to, I think a lot of the reasons why companies have worked with us, in particular through the recession, is that they see the value, the core value of what we do is around, yes, it's about emission reduction, but it's about emission reduction that delivers real value and cost savings to businesses. We've also been fortunate in that we benefited from stimulus funding for SMEs. So we've been able to, over the past 12 months, significantly scale up our SME loan fund. And also we've been working hard, as I'll go on to talk about a little bit more, around deploying our standards. So we've been working with 200 companies, 200 organizations on the Carbon Trust standard, and also with a number of organizations around footprinting products and services. And to date, we've footprinted 5,000 products, and we've awarded the Carbon Trust reduction label to products with a sales value of 2.5 billion. And overall, all that business benefit has delivered also environmental benefits. So we've reduced emissions by 23 million tonnes. In terms of developing new low-carbon technologies, this has been a real area of focus for the Carbon Trust over the past 2 years. So historically, we've been very active around carbon now and deploying existing technologies. But over the past couple of years, we've worked very hard to scale up our technology development activity. And what that translates to in practice is we've launched 7 technology accelerators. So a technology accelerator is where we see an industry sector with a lot of potential both to reduce carbon emissions and to add economic value for the UK. And we give some examples there on the slide. So biomass, marine, buildings, offshore wind. A second area of activity is around research accelerators. So that's where we see an emerging technology or research team in the UK that we think is really leading edge globally, and give them the resources to scale up their activity to the point where they can get significant private sector funding. But as well as going out and identifying areas where we think the UK has leadership, we're also open for people to come to us with their ideas. And we do that in 3 ways. So we have an open call where people can come and get grant funding of up to 500,000. And to date, we've supported up to 175 projects. We also provide incubation support. So as well as providing grant funding to help organizations develop their technology, alongside that we provide management support to help them ensure that they have the right business plan, ultimately get financed at scale. And again, we've had some success in that area. We've supported 95 companies who in turn have raised investment of £86 million. And then the last area of activity is around venture capital activity. We have an early stage venture capital team that's been particularly important, I think, over the past 12 months. As other venture capitalists have kind of moved out of this sector, we've been able to come in and to some degree, again, with stimulus funding, been able to fill some of that gap and support companies that otherwise would have probably gone out of business. And overall to date, we've supported 300 companies in what we believe is a material way in terms of moving them towards commercialization. Going forward, as Tom outlined, really we have 3 priorities, and this very much builds on what we've been doing since 2001. So yes, we're moving forward, but we're trying to keep the best of what we've already been doing, but also to innovate and to move forward in line with the context that Tom laid out. And what that translates to in practice is continuing to provide specialist support and finance, but as I'll go on to talk about, the nature of that support is going to evolve. In terms of ambition, I talked about us saving 1.4 billion since 2001. Going forward over the next 3 years, we want to significantly ramp up that impact and in effect save 2 billion over the next 3 years, so in effect doubling our impact. Secondly, in terms of standards, we see a real opportunity to work with organizations to help them measure, reduce and communicate their emissions, both from the point of view of their organization, but also from the point of view of their products and services. And then lastly, we think the UK has a pretty good hand in terms of developing a low-carbon technology hub in the UK, and there are a number of technology areas where the UK has potentially advantages and we can make a difference in terms of moving those sectors forward. So to give you a little bit more detail around advice and finance. So yes, firstly, we're trying to scale up our impact, but what does that mean in practice? I mean, it's quite interesting. Since we started, awareness among businesses around climate change has increased significantly, but the vast majority of work that we do with organizations is still around bread and butter energy efficiency. Before the recession, we were starting to see more leadership from corporates around thinking, medium to long term about what a low carbon economy might mean for their corporate strategy. That work decreased a little bit over the course of the recession, but actually we're starting to see that come back now, and we're starting to see more organizations interested in that approach. So for large companies and for public sector organizations, our focus is going to be continue to provide cost-effective energy efficiency support, but in parallel give them support and advice around more strategic issues. A second big focus for us is developing our services for SMEs, and we do that in 2 ways. One, we've been working very hard to increase the cost effectiveness of our direct support to SMEs, and particularly providing on-site surveys to as many SMEs as we possibly can within the funding constraints that we have. But secondly, through our interest-free loan scheme. Over the past year, as I said, we've got stimulus funding for that scheme. We've ramped it up from a £20 million a year scheme to what will probably be a 55 million scheme this year. And we hope to run it at a similar level next year. And then on an ongoing basis, we also are exploring raising private sector finance to run it even at a much bigger scale going forward. And then lastly, we also work and fund Salix Finance, who provides financial support for the public sector. One example of our loan scheme, this is a company in Durham that develops steel components, and you can see we've given them quite a big loan, and as you would expect, they've benefited significantly, both in terms of emission reduction and cost savings. But I think that the other thing that's interesting about this case study is the company would also say that the air compression system that we helped them install very much increased their productivity and positioned them as a low-carbon leader in this space. And one of the things I think you as stakeholders have really helped us to do, one of the challenges we had was to scale up the loan scheme. So we had to reach out to much more organizations in order to deploy our available funding. And I just wanted to say thank you for doing that, and kind of look forward to continuing to work with you, continue to do that going forward, because cost-effectively working with SMEs is one of the kind of biggest challenges I think we have faced and continue to face. In terms of setting standards, if you're not familiar, the Carbon Trust standard has been running for about 18 months. It really was set up on the back of feedback from our stakeholders saying that we really like what you do in terms of advice, but when we make green claims, really our consumers and our stakeholders don't believe us. So we developed the Carbon Trust standard with the aim of measuring, reducing, which is probably the most important thing for us, and communicating emission reductions for an organization. To date, we have worked with 200 companies. We're ambitious going forward for this scheme. We want to sign up an additional 400 organizations. We want to build the value of the scheme to customers. So we want to communicate to stakeholders the importance of systematically measuring and reducing and communicating. We also want to define a cost-effective solution to help SMEs. And we're also looking at launching the Carbon Trust Standard overseas, working with some of the larger organizations we're already working with. In terms of footprinting products and services, again, I think it's interesting just to reflect on where this activity came from. Again, this activity was informed by our stakeholders. Again, around feedback, when we make green claims around products and services, our stakeholders don't believe us. So again, it's very similar to the Carbon Trust standard. It's around measuring, reducing the footprint of products and services. And our aspiration is to achieve significant market growth and to scale up that activity going forward. An example of the Carbon Trust standard in practice is First Direct. And again, I think it's quite interesting, as you would expect to see kind of very significant cost and emission savings. But again, there are some softer reasons why this organization in particular worked with us on this. One was around, it fitted very well with their brand positioning of being an innovative online bank. But secondly, from the point of view of its employees, it was incredibly important to show leadership on this issue. Moving on then to our kind of third priority area around catalyzing low-carbon innovation. We've already, as I said, significantly scaled up our activity in this area. But we have a number of new initiatives that are just in the kind of early scale of scaling up. So offshore wind and marine I'm going to talk about in a second, but also industrial energy efficiency. It's a less obvious and less sexy low-carbon technology sector, but we're investing £15 million in order to work with manufacturing industry in the UK to reduce carbon emissions in that sector by 20 to 30%. Secondly, in terms of research accelerators I talked about earlier, I will talk about PV in a second, but we're also looking at initiatives in advanced bioenergy and fuel cells. And also in terms of incubators and applied research, we continue to run and hopefully deliver impact through those schemes. In terms of marine energy, I think it's an interesting sector. It's a good example of an early stage technology where the UK is potentially advantaged. We've got great resource, we've got some very interesting companies. Whether the technology ultimately works or not, we've got to wait and see. So what we need to do is get this technology on a different cost curve. And we have a number of initiatives really focused on that. So we have the Marine Energy Accelerator, which is a £3.5 million investment, specifically looking at step changes in cost reduction in that technology. And again, in terms of stimulus funding, we've been fortunate that we have had £22.5 million of funding through the Marine Renewables Proving Fund. And the results of that competition that we ran over the past few months around which technologies are going to benefit from that funding will be announced probably in early February of this year. Offshore wind, again, a kind of very exciting technology from a UK perspective, but obviously at a much later stage. So here it's not about getting on a different cost curve, it's about accelerating progress down the existing cost curve. Again, the UK has got terrific resource. We're potentially a leader in this space, but one of the really big issues is the technology is expensive today. So our focus really is around reducing the cost of that technology by 10%. On the slide, we summarize the organizations we're currently working with. So we have a £50 million initiative specifically designed around overcoming the main technical barriers to cost reduction in that technology. It's an area where we're keen to get other partners involved to help us scale up that activity. So if you are interested in that, by all means, talk to me or one of the team. The third example of our activity is photovoltaics. I mean, existing technology has made significant cost reduction over the past few years. But if we are going to deploy this technology at scale, particularly in environments such as the UK, we really need a breakthrough in cost, and that's what we're trying to do here. So we, again, ran a competition, and out of the back of that competition, one of the organisations we're working with is Cambridge University. We put £5 million of funding into that to give the researchers the resources to get the technology to the point where hopefully the private sector will come in and back it at scale. And then finally, our VC activity. As I mentioned, the last 12 months has been difficult for the VC sector. We have benefited from stimulus funding, which I think in turn has benefited the sector. Our intention is to continue to be very active in this space, to support as many of our existing investments as we can, but also looking at supporting new companies over time. And then over the next couple of years, potentially raise a private sector fund to, again, scale up our activity in this area. And again, just an example of one of the companies we've supported through our VC activity, For Energy, benefited from a £1 million investment. They're focused on innovative cooling systems, particularly in the telecoms area. Through our VC funding, they've been able to scale up their activity, not only in the UK, but beyond, and one of the kind of forerunning companies to demonstrate the type of financial opportunities there are for companies that innovate in this space. As well as developing and supporting technology innovations, there are two other activities that we wanted to mention. The first one is around, we work with lots of companies, both around deploying existing technology and developing new technology. And through that, I think we develop real insights into some of the barriers and issues, both from a policymaker's point of view and from a business person's point of view. And we try to share those insights in a way that accelerates progress towards a low-carbon economy. The type of activities we've been doing in that space are around looking at the EU ETS and to what extent it is good or bad for competitiveness, looking at energy efficiency as an opportunity and how the policy framework can evolve to accelerate that, and looking at low-carbon innovations, and indeed the Focus for Success report, as I'll talk about in a second, is an example of that. The second area is around identifying opportunities to catalyze markets. So opportunities where we see a potential big market, but for whatever reason there are barriers that are stopping the private sector from capturing and scaling up that opportunity. Two examples where we're active are partnerships for Renewables, which is developing wind power in public sector land, and In-Source Energy, which is a waste-to-energy business. And then this I mentioned Focus for Success. Focus for Success was really looking at how the UK could become a leader in low-carbon innovation. And I think our recipe for success is somewhat different to conventional thinking, at least, around innovation, particularly in the UK. So we looked in depth at 6 particular technologies, but the 2 headline conclusions, kind of both looking bottom up at those 6 technologies and also leveraging our experience, was that the UK should become much more focused on individual technologies where it is advantaged or potentially advantaged, i.e. focus our investment, recognizing investment is limited. And then secondly, for those technologies that we do prioritize, to put much more effort around systematically overcoming the barriers for those technologies. So don't assume kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, particularly from a policy perspective, will get the job done. Tailor the interventions for those particular technologies. And we also looked at what the kind of financial and carbon benefits were for such an approach. And as Tom said, we do think there's a very strong case for supporting the UK as a low-carbon hub. And indeed, we have a very good set of cards to play. So that's just a very quick run-through our priorities and activity. What we're going to do now is Tom and I are going to take questions. We have roving mics. So as Tom said, don't be shy. This is at least one of your opportunities. As Tom said, we'll also be around, and the Carbon Trust team will be around afterwards. So if you have specific questions about your company or organization, we're very happy to take those offline. And then, as Tom said as well, we have the kind of email feedback process. So we've got one. We'll start in the front. That's probably easier in terms of, yeah. If you just say who you are as well, that would just help us in the audience.
Louis Lockley from DHL. You spoke a little bit about the standards that you've launched that companies adopt to show that they've been endorsed by the Carbon Trust, and a standard that can be used across many industries. Do you not think that ultimately the motivation for businesses to make this transformation has got to come through their balance sheets and their share price, forced by government accounting standards, which are reflected in some sort of endorsement of their accounts in the same way as they have to be audited? And if their audit is not satisfactory, then that affects their share price. And that's the way, really, to incentivize the CEOs and CFOs to drive some top-down change in the way they do business.
Yeah, can I have a go at that? Yeah. I think it's quite interesting. We did a study about a year and a half ago with McKinsey looking at how ready business was for a move to a low-carbon economy. And one of the conclusions from that was that business is kind of assuming the world is on track for somewhere like 700 to 1,000 parts per million of CO2. So that's kind of a planning assumption for business. And if you dig into a bit more detail about why business is assuming this, and this was obviously pre-Copenhagen given the timing I gave, they say, well, they're skeptical about policymakers' ability to strike a global deal. And they'll think, in any case, it will take longer than people say. And they're also think if even there is a global deal, local policymakers will give them a soft landing. So they basically say time is on their side. So I think you're right in that the policy framework can make a huge difference. But I think there's the issue about how fast the UK can go relative to other countries. Because I think one of the things we hear consistently from business is around the need for a level playing field across the world. So given that context, I think the question we ask is, given the tools at our disposal, what can we do to really accelerate progress? And one of the reasons we're excited about standards is it seems to resonate with what we would see as leadership companies. So it's companies that are willing to put their brand on the line to say that we're trying to do the right thing around emission reduction, we're trying to measure it in a consistent way, we're trying to reduce in a consistent way, we want to tell people about it in a consistent way. And the exciting thing about that for me is that causes lots of other companies to say, well, hang on a second, that list of companies you showed in your slides, they're really excellent companies. So if they think this is a good thing for their business, surely it's a good thing for my business. And the other thing I'd say is, in terms of the companies we're working with on footprinting generally, we find it's a very effective lens to identify cost savings, because traditionally we just looked at organizations, but when you start looking up and down supply chains, actually you find some really transformational savings that are very beneficial. So that's probably a long answer. I'll try to be shorter. Okay, there's one just at the back there.
Yeah, John Price. I wanted to ask you a question which I asked you last year, so I'll just give you a bit of a heads up on international strategy. Last year you made a bit of a play about talking around your connections with China and with the US, and I think a Middle East play as well. And I think there were very valuable announcements that you made, and clearly, in my view, that any technology innovation is an international situation, it's not a national solution. And then there was a bit in the press early in the year about taxpayers' money. I just wanted to understand, is there some, concern about spending UK public money, which is preventing you from doing things international, which is probably the right thing to do? And if so, how can you overcome that?
Yeah. Do you want me to say that one? Yeah. Basically, we picked up about 18 months ago a real willingness to learn from and share with us the experience that other people have got at trying to tackle climate change and mitigate emissions, and actually wanting to engage with us in a very different way, not just, that's interesting, what can we do, but actually make something that's of value to both sides. And we looked at potential opportunities in the US, in China, and in Australia. And the common theme to all of those is that, firstly, we believe that they are consistent with delivering UK benefit in terms of benefiting the UK businesses who will export into those markets and maybe have trading links to those markets and so on. Secondly, we are very sensitive to the fact that UK taxpayers' money is acutely under scrutiny at the moment. And therefore, what we have said is quite simply, we will allocate what turns out to be about 1% of our core funding to seed activity internationally, on the premise that if it is really valuable to those other organisations, to those other countries, we will find other ways of funding the rest. Now, that's what we've done. We've used 1% of our core budget to seed activity in a number of countries, and there are some quite interesting things coming out of that. The first must be that, I think it's next week, in fact, Carbon Trust Australia will be having its first board meeting. It is a company being set up in Australia, broadly speaking, doing carbon trust type things, being funded by the Australian government, and they have agreed to license from us our know-how and our brand to enable them to do it more effectively with business in Australia. So that's just an example where you can get a positive return, in our case, to the Carbon Trust. But more importantly, For Energy, which is one of the businesses that Michael talked about there, is a terrific company that has recognised the opportunity for energy efficiency in data centres and mobile telephony. And essentially, a mobile telephone mast has quite a lot of kit around it. And the conventional approach is you turn up the air conditioning until the whole lot cools down enough to operate. Now, that's a very expensive way of operating. Instead of that, you can actually focus on the 6 or 7 components that need to be kept cool, let the rest boil to buggery, and it works very well. So energy efficiency by point cooling of certain bits of equipment in data centers and mobile telephony. Now, having been successful in the European market, and it is a company that's successful in the European market that we've had a long relationship with, they obviously ask the question, what are the other big markets in the world? And China just comes up time and time again. China Mobile's development of its mobile telephone network is extraordinary. So, through our relationships there, For Energy, a UK business, has now got on trial some of its kit with China Mobile. That's kind of the win-win that we're looking for in our international activity. We haven't played it up. We haven't played it down. It's progressing nicely in terms of US, Chinese, and Australian engagement. And I don't think, honestly, it's a constraint to us. I mean, it would be nice if somebody came along and said, look, here's a thumping great budget to go and do other things elsewhere. I think the challenge of saying, no, look, the UK core budget is there to seed activity. If it really is valuable, then other people are going to come along and fund it. It is a fair approach.
You didn't mention anything about nuclear energy in your brief summary. Just tell me where the Carbon Trust is in helping stimulate that development, which obviously many of us believe is critical to the future.
Yeah. Nuclear energy is something on which I suppose organisationally we're quite agnostic. We took a view on it about 3 or 4 years ago, and I think our view would still be the same today. It clearly has a role to play in building a low-carbon economy because it's a low-carbon technology. There are 2 sort of key issues. One is public acceptability, particularly around the waste management issue that still has some way to go to be resolved. And the second is financing. And the only thing which I think is consistent is that there is no really fully developed costing of a nuclear program anywhere in the world that we can find and that most people can find, because to some degree nuclear has always been supported by subsidy or intervention, which makes it very difficult to cost it. So at the moment it's a big unknown. I suspect actually that what is being put forward, which is surely if we have some sort of carbon price in place, then nuclear will kick in as being viable, is probably the right answer. But I suppose the other thing I'd say is, apart from giving the overall framework and commentary on EU ETS and what one can do to sustain a carbon price, we don't feel we can be material in helping the development of nuclear. Maybe I'm wrong.
I just challenge that. You and others talk very positively about developing cost-effective renewables.
Yep.
And you do feel Carbon Trust has a critical role in helping that. I don't see why you don't apply that same perspective to saying we've got to have nuclear. How do we make it cost-effective?
I think the big difference would be that most of the emerging technologies that we work with are technologies that are at the beginning of their journey in terms of cost effectiveness and reduction. Nuclear has been around for some time, it's been proven for some time, and it's still relatively expensive. Now, I think there are big changes to be made. 3rd and maybe 4th generation nuclear will probably be more reliable and significantly cheaper. Now, whether we can have a material impact in that area, I don't know. But it's a good challenge. It's a fair one. 2 or 3 years ago, people asked us the same thing. Why aren't you active in, I think it was offshore wind? And we said we didn't feel we could be material. Actually, we found that by convening industry partners who are happy to work with us, sitting there trying to make sure that all their interests are appropriately followed, it works very well. So maybe it's something we should be doing.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, this one over here. We've got time for probably 2 or 3 more, just to warn you.
Steve Brambley from Gambika. Just wanted to ask on the loan scheme, which is currently been expanded further than SMEs, but not obviously open to every single size of company. And really the question is why could that not be expanded on the basis of the criteria for the loan based around carbon saving, that there are larger companies who could meet those criteria, and particularly in an economic environment where there are some, let's say, hopes of recovery, which would need to be funded, but there's obviously a lot of doubts about whether the banks are going to fund that, and it could, in fact, prevent that kind of recovery.
That's me. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when we set up the scheme originally, we broadly looked at the barriers for kind of large and small companies. And one of the things that came through very strongly for small companies in particular at the time was around finance being a barrier. That didn't really come true for large companies, although I think if we did the same exercise now, that would come true more strongly. And that's why we originally developed the scheme. The stimulus funding that we've been deploying is particularly funding to support SMEs. So we've stretched it as far as we possibly can in terms of the definition of SMEs, but you're right, it doesn't support larger companies. And one of the things I think we want to look at going forward is we're constantly keeping the sectors we're working with under review to understand the barriers. So if finance continues to be a key barrier for larger organizations, then that's something we will look at and react to. And as I mentioned as well, one of the things we're looking at is about raising a private sector backed loan scheme. And again, one of the things we could look at is expanding that out to a kind of a larger set of organizations. Okay. Greg had one here. Then I'll do yourself, yeah.
Greg Archer from the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. Historically, the Carbon Trust has done relatively little work in transport, but more recently you have done your research accelerator on algal biofuels.
Yeah.
There's been some investments, I think, in low-carbon automotive companies, and more widely, you've done some transport work as part of carbon management. Do you see transport as being one of the sectors where you become more involved in the future, or are you going to continue with this relatively modest level of activity?
I think it comes back to our mission. I mean, as we talked about, when looking at opportunities, we really look at how material something would be against our mission. Would we, working with others, be able to make a difference in terms of overcoming the barriers? And it maybe links back to the discussion we had on nuclear and offshore wind. So again, for quite some time when we looked at transport, given the amount of resource the automotive industry were putting into the sector at the time, we really questioned if we could be material. But we kept a watching brief on it, and we kept looking at kind of early stage technologies as they emerged. And we found a couple of areas in pyrolysis and algae where we think we have some leading teams in the UK, and we're potentially world-class globally, and those teams are worth backing. And one of the things that we can bring to that is we can bring a very kind of commercial focus to complement the academic focus of those teams. So I think it's opportunity dependent. If the right opportunities come forward and we think they're really material against our mission, I think we would look at them very seriously. Okay, there was a question here.
Yeah, I think I've just picking up on that. I think you've largely answered it, but I'll follow through on that. My name's Tim Fox. I'm from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. You mentioned that you look to back technologies and technologies that are strategically important for the UK. And I'm just really quite curious to know who ultimately makes that decision. Yeah. I mean, you say there's an opportunity component in there. You keep using the we in the sort of royal we sense. Who, given that there's public money involved and there's potentially some peer review process that takes place? I don't know. I'm looking for an answer to that.
Yeah. Why don't I kick off and you can add in. I think we're very systematic about how we do it. So every 2 or 3 years, we run kind of a broad technology assessment. So we look typically at kind of 50-plus technologies that are emerging and try to understand where those technologies are on the innovation journey, what the barriers are specifically to developing those technologies, to what extent the UK needs those technologies from an emission reduction point of view, and or to what extent those technologies have economic benefit. And all that fact base, if you like, goes into a prioritization. And so we're looking at how material can it be against our mission, how material can we be in terms of moving it forward. Then that goes through our investment committee decision-making process, which is a subset of our board. So we sit down with the board, often informed by external experts. Because offshore wind is a good example. When we started out, we weren't experts in offshore wind. But by working with experts over the years and by bringing in the right experts, we've developed expertise. So we take our expertise informed by other kind of leaders in the field and take that fact base to our board, our investment committee as appropriate, and make the case for an investment. And we are pretty rigorous about understanding what really is the business case, because you're right, it is public money. So we want to be absolutely convinced we're using it in the best way possible. I think the other thing I would say, as our activities start to flow through and come to fruition, we're very systematic as well about trying to take the lessons about what we've done well and what we've done less well and what the impact we have had is, and then feeding that back to better inform what we do. So our research accelerators, it's a relatively new type of activity, but that was informed by working with applied research for a number of years. So we saw these great innovations coming through. But what we often found was the organizations concerned didn't have the resource to really scale them up. And from a venture capital point of view, it was just too risky. So we thought about what kind of intervention could we design that would significantly scale up activity. But yeah, innovation is not an exact science.
I'll just, if I may, just bring two things together that I think is interesting. It's the carbon lens. We talked about kind of a lot of experience, which I came from a big oil company where 9 years wouldn't count for very much in terms of experience. But actually, in the low-carbon world, being around for 9 years and having gone through umpteen different proposals and technologies and cases and businesses, we've got some experience to draw upon. Sharing that experience in the context of a particular sector has been very valuable. So providing the carbon lens to do a risk assessment of the technology and the market that technology will be deployed in, and being able to combine those 2 points is relatively unusual. Now, what we do is we take that approach. We support it with an awful lot of external input, peer review and others. Almost always, if there's an area where you will find us having put significant funding and focus in, it's because we've done a lot of work on it, and we've almost always published those results. So actually, if you just look at the publications the Carbon Trust has put out on things like wet renewables, marine, tidal and offshore wind, our fact base is pretty much out there in the public domain. To some degree, we have to conceal, obviously, the commercially sensitive elements of that, but it's pretty upfront and out there. And it's our ability, I think, to take our experience and translate it into a carbon lens that we then look at various activities through. And that applies to our innovation support. It also applies to the loans that we provide. At the end of the day, what are we? We're not as big as a bank. We're probably not as efficient as a bank. I think we're doing a pretty good job, but we're subscale in those terms. On the other hand, we have got an ability to look at an opportunity and assess the carbon effectiveness of that loan very objectively, based on our experience, to say, yeah, that equipment in that company to do that will deliver the following savings, financial and carbon, and against that, we reckon that a loan should be made. So the carbon lens is the one thing, I think, which goes right across the Carbon Trust. It's the one thing that we have.
There's a question just here.
Maybe it should be the last question then.
Yeah.
Move on.
My name is Colin Leadsom. Amongst the many hats I wear, I'm Vice Chairman of the Institution of Engineering Designers and a Fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers down at the front there. Engineers are, by their very nature, long-term thinkers compared to the financial sector. So we tend to look less at the financial outlook. To call yourself less efficient than the banking industry after the last year's experience is a bit frightening.
I say that as a mechanical engineer.
Amongst my various activities, I sit on various committees at the British Standards Institution, and you mentioned your own standard setting work. Obviously, British standards are a little more long-term and international than what you're looking at. But I would recommend that you seriously consider looking at the appropriate standards that are available, that are appropriate to this whole field. And certainly on the committees that I sit, the efficiency of the products we're setting the standards to, and not just carbon but other things as well, is very important. I would, as an example, cite just one with the catchy title of British Standard 8887, which has the written title of Manufacturing, Assembly, Disassembly and End-of-Life Processing, with the catchy little thing of made tacked on the end. What we're looking at is the recycling of materials so that when a product comes to the end of its life, it is not simply scrap. It has a value. And the values are in the energy expended in actually manufacturing it. And so some of its components may be used again as components in other products. And at the low end, if you can't use the components, at least you can recycle the materials in some way. And seeing materials as being produced as raw materials and then perhaps cycling through half a dozen different products through their lifetime until they become filler in some other material or simply landfill. There becomes a point where you just simply can't use it again. Trying to follow up that system from scratch is a long and complicated process. Now, obviously, what you're doing is very much short-term in terms of what we're thinking. We're thinking of something, a material that may cycle through a number of products over a very long period of time. At each stage, it will save carbon by being reused. It will save carbon by not using the energy to remanufacture it. So can I simply recommend to you that you sit alongside people like British Standards and their international partners to make sure that, first of all, the standards that we're producing match with what you're doing, and that what you're doing takes account of the longer-term standards that we're trying to produce.
I welcome that. We do work very closely with BSI. In fact, BSI and DEFRA and ourselves were responsible for PAS 2050, which is I think the first accepted standard that is being used around the world at the moment to measure the embodied carbon in products and services. And one of the most contentious areas I know in the development of that standard, because I got some fairly abusive correspondence about it, was the treatment of recycled material, particularly metals and aluminium was a sensitive area. Now, we've reached a working agreement that is now embodied as part of that standard, and that's great going forward. But the real value, actually, in understanding the embodied carbon in products and services, as Michael was saying, is not just sharing the information with stakeholders, employees, investors, consumers, and so on. It's in being able to look up the supply chain and say, well, if that's the embodied carbon, where's it come from? And broadly speaking, we see kind of two stages of development. The first is to say, my word, I didn't realize we were so inefficient in our treatment of energy, particularly along that supply chain. And here are some opportunities that are fairly straightforward things that we can do to improve the energy efficiency of that supply chain. But the next stage, and I think it's probably the next generation, sadly, is the situation where companies turn around and say, yeah, we actually want to make lower carbon products. We actually want to design in low carbon from the outset. And there are some organizations that are starting to do that because systematically they're looking at everything they sell and they're looking at the carbon impact of it. I mean, the most obvious would be Marshall's paving slabs, and Marshall's, I don't know if anybody from Marshall's is here, who basically have put the carbon footprint of every single product into their catalogue. Now, as a result of that, I know they have looked at products that are intrinsically low carbon, not just through efficiency, but by design. And I think that is absolutely the future. I think you're 5 years ahead of our time. I think we probably need to...
Yeah, I think we're out of time for now on Q&A, but do please kind of pick Tom or I, or indeed anybody from the Carbon Trust team up after the debate. Don't move. We need to rearrange the furniture slightly.